Hi, I'm Charlie Mato-Toyela with Blue Bear Flutes. Our website, if you haven't found it yet, is bluebearflutes.com. That's bluebearflutes.com. Once again, bluebearflutes.com. Of course, that's my 1980s and 90s impression of a radio advertisement, I think. I've had people ask me, what's your website? So I thought I would make sure I mentioned it a couple of times here on this video. If you missed it, it was bluebearflutes.com. Anyway, today's video, don't forget our Instagram. I never want you to forget to check out that Instagram. If you're not into Instagram, you can see it actually, the feed on the bottom of my website. There's a little button there for it, so you can check and see what's going on. We have a lot of really beautiful stuff there. There's videos, there are live streams on occasion, there are just about everything you can imagine. Lots of pictures, of course, of places we've been and things we do. Today's video is just a quick kind of a question answered video. A lot of people ask me, what is the best Native American flute for a beginner? And in the world of Native American flutes, there are a lot of flutes available for you these days. And of course, we do like to promote our own, but I will mention in some cases where if you decide to go outside of Blue Bear Flutes to get a Native American flute, at least to give you some ideas of what to look for and what to find. But in the case of our flutes, I'm going to try to go over several questions that people have asked over the years, and even especially in recent times. Would this be a good flute for a beginner? Is this a good flute for a beginner? And maybe kind of dispel some of the notions that may not be leading you in the best direction. So to begin with, the first thing people are concerned with is the price, because you've seen some Native American flutes out there that weren't on my website, and they're incredibly expensive. And you've seen some that weren't on my website that were super cheap, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of those. There are some things to consider if you're a beginner and you're thinking about playing a musical instrument for the first time, or if you've played other instruments and you want to play something that is a Native American flute. So to start off, the first question people ask is usually, what's the least expensive flute that you've got? And the least expensive flutes that I have are going to be smaller than the most expensive flutes that I have. Large usually equates to more work and of course more materials, but the amount of material difference between this one and this one is probably immaterial. So how that goes is this flute here takes much more time to create than maybe that one does, and certainly a lot more than this one. This is a 4-hole whistle. A 4-hole whistle is a historic example of a Native American flute. Very important to me personally. I've got videos on that. But with regards to this instrument, it's a high tone. I mean, it's small, so the smaller it is, usually the higher the tone is. I do have some videos about demonstrations of different keys and a range of flutes that you can listen to, and there'll be a link to that in our description here, so make sure you check that out. And with regards to people that have maybe small hands, for example, you might think, well, I need a smaller flute. I do have a video about that as well, so that's also in the description. So this is a 4-hole whistle. Plays the same scale as a Native American flute. It can sound very, or rather I should say as most other Native American flutes, it sounds very high in tone, and it can be made to sound really beautiful and mellow. It's incredibly versatile. You can play major keys on it, you can play it chromatically, you can play it a lot of different ways. So it's a neat little instrument, but it's tiny. Some people say it's too shrill for me. Well, I have tinnitus and I make musical instruments and I have pretty good hearing on top of that. So I personally love that. That's the reason I keep it in my pocket. Something I couldn't probably live without, not very happily anyway. So the next size up flute that we make, which is still a Native American flute based on historical references and what have you, a tiny little 5-hole flute. And this tiny little flute will play the same notes and scale as any other Native American flutes that you find anywhere. It is something you can play chromatically. If you don't know what that means, it means it'll play basically every note from one range to another and everything in between. All the notes on the piano for whatever octave range the flute has, which most of our flutes are about 1.5 octaves, which means you can start and play, and then there's other notes you can play in between. So lots of stuff there. But it is a high tone flute. So as a high tone instrument, it is very beautiful in my opinion, something I really love. And for the convenience sake, it is something you can carry around in your pocket, which is kind of nice. The next question a lot of people ask me is, I thought Native American flutes are supposed to be really low toned. And historically, there again, that's not something we find. Historically, I should say, that is something we find in cowboys and Indian westerns, basically. And the reason for this is most of the flutes that were played in old, especially black and white or pre-60s, any kind of Native American or cowboys and Indian movies that aren't specific to like a historical recording of a native playing a flute, usually they're played on a transverse flute that's from an orchestra. A transverse flute can play several octaves, usually at least 3 by a skilled player. It is usually something that can play a low C, you know, and I'm talking about a low tone flute. I don't even, here's an E up here, which is still not that low. And then this low A is really close. So once again, historically, the tone that you may hear in a Cowboys and Indian movie is not what we find examples of in Native American artifacts or really traditions or cultural history or anything like that. So keep that in mind. But I do make low tone flutes. This one here is kind of convenient. It is a 5-hole flute. This one in the back's for your thumb, and you play it. I've got videos about this, so we won't go over great detail, but a lot of you are saying, oh, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Well, you might think that, but let me tell you something. As far as the transitioning between notes, higher tone flutes transition more quickly than lower tone flutes do. So if you're planning on playing, you know, a pop song, you know, your favorite Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber, Welcome to the Jungle, whatever you're going to play on a Native American flute, it might be harder to play that on a really low tone flute. Okay, so you're not going to play those type of notes, those type of songs. Playing Native American flute music, which you have heard in recordings, is usually not on one of these. You might find it on one of them on occasion, but there again, this flute is not something historically that we find in Native American history. And even this mouthpiece here is something that I have done to make this easier for someone to play who has maybe smaller hands, but I wouldn't recommend it for a beginner for a number of reasons. Number one, it's budget. It's incredibly expensive. I mean, not incredibly, but I mean, anywhere you find a really low tone bass A flute, it's going to be a little high. And number two, you've spent all that time and all that effort and all that money getting your first flute. Why not start with something that is easier to play, that takes less air, that is, you know, kind of more along the lines of what people do today. That's really what I think you probably would want, even though, you know, I hear people yelling in the background of this video, I want that flute. It's not like that. Playing a really low tone flute, I mean, I've been playing for 35 years at this point in this video, so keep that in mind. Something that is maybe a couple steps up from that, this is a low E flute, and the next one down is a low D flute, which you hear the D in the intro to these videos. This low E flute is one of my 2 favorite toned flutes that we make. The high B and the low E are my favorites. They just work for me. I don't know why. This is a really great flute. For beginners, you're just missing it by this much. The next tone up from this that we offer is an F sharp. An F sharp is really, in my opinion, and what I have recommended for a lot of people, if you want a lower tone Native American flute and you're a beginner, this is a good place to start. It is easier to play than the E. The finger spread, which I have a video about that. I guess we'll put that one in the description too. I have a little printout that you can make, and you can find out basically if your fingers are going to fit this flute or not. But you'll notice the finger spread on the top here, the low E flute, is a little wider and a little further apart and a little bit bigger than they are of the F sharp. The F sharp is a mid-range flute. The E is where we start getting into low-tone flutes. So with my demonstration video that we talked about a moment ago that has all the keys, or many of the keys anyway, you can kind of see the difference between the size and hear the tones and everything of that nature, so it'll give you an idea. This F sharp that's a great sound. I mean, this is what a lot of people really want to play after they've played everything else. This is a great flute. Once again, not necessarily historical size of Native American flute, but here we go with one that actually is a little bit closer. This is a G flute, which is basically a half step above the F sharp, 2 steps above the E, give or take. So it's not really much different, but if you listen, you can tell it is a higher tone flute than the F sharp, the E, and of course the low bass A. It is a higher tone flute, but once again, we're getting closer to the historical range. There have been flutes that people have made that are really close to G. So this is something that historically kind of fits the bill, and for your tone that you're looking for, that lower tone, and not too low, of course, this is a good starting point too. So that's a good starting point. The next one up that a lot of people recommend, and I'll tell you why they recommend it in just a second, but this is an A flute. The A flute is what, I guess for the last 10 or 15 years, since the popularity of the Native American flutes really skyrocketed, which sounds so weird to say that, especially being Native, but the A flute is something that a lot of people recommend. I recommend it to some people. I like to give you the pros and cons about everything. An A flute is actually in the same range as, say, for example, a violin. And I guess range is not necessarily the appropriate word, but violin usually is in the key of A and D, and this is in the key of A, and it can also play some of the D notes, so because A and D are a fifth. Anyway, staying away from all that technical mumbo jumbo. You need to not look for that when you're trying to do the first time flute. I mean, unless you're into it. So this is an A flute. I've got 3 total A flutes here that I'm going to show you so that you can get kind of an idea. Historically, this is kind of close. I mean, not only is the tone about right, I mean, we didn't make flutes that were in a key of this or a key of that, but this is kind of close to 1 or 2 that maybe, have been discovered. It has a small opening for the mouthpiece. A lot of these do that I showed you. As a matter of fact, all of them, except for these 2 little guys, have a small opening for the mouthpiece. That might be convenient for you. A lot of people who buy a Native American flute are looking for a mouthpiece that is shaped kind of like a point, or for lack of a better term, a nipple. And that kind of shape, in my opinion, even though some historic flutes did have those, is not conducive to playing this instrument for a long period of time. I've got videos about that, and the thing that you're going to look for is something called wetting out. Anytime you put something in your mouth, it triggers the salivary response, and that salivary reaction causes you to produce a lot of saliva, like I'm doing right now. And when you produce all that saliva, a lot of times the vapor in your mouth, the moisture, gets even more increased, and the moisture starts to push through the flute. As it pushes through the flute, wetting out is actually when water gets trapped under this critical piece of the flute here, and it starts making a gurgling sound. That's not something that's really great. As a matter of fact, most of our flutes are made in such a way that it doesn't promote wetting out, and in addition to that, some of the things that we do underneath this block, which is completely natural and relatively historical, in some ways, but not necessarily every flute has an example of it, it actually helps to stop it from doing that. So that's something to keep in mind. There are flute makers out there that inlay some crazy space-age material under this thing to stop it from wetting out, but nothing really stops it completely. The only thing we can do is avoid it. Don't eat while you're playing the flute. That's something that'll stop it. Don't eat 10 minutes before you play the flute. Try not to drink too much unless it's just water. Nothing sugary, because sugar, once again, causes that salivary reaction. Don't shove the flute in your mouth. My flutes are made that you put your lips like you're kissing the flute. You don't have to put it in your mouth, and I would definitely not recommend it, because that'll cause some damage to the flute, because you start digesting the flute, and I don't know if that's something you want to think about, so let's not talk about it. Anyway, so that little opening there is convenient in a lot of ways, but historically it had examples of that. Doesn't always have examples of that. This is a key of A flute with an open mouthpiece. This is really what I prefer, is the open mouthpiece. And the reason I prefer it, not only because you can still play it the same way by putting your lips up to it, you actually kind of push your lips inside of it. Not really hard or anything, but you put your lips up to it and blow, and that's all you do. You don't have to try to eat it. So this is a key of A flute, and this is one of our Simple Traditions flutes. The other one's made out of Western cedar. Simple Traditions flutes have an open mouthpiece. They're made out of poplar, which is a medium hardwood, and they're incredibly sustainably made. I mean, on so many different levels. The wood is actually sustainably forested. They raise poplar for making lumber, so that's kind of nice. It's not incredibly hard like a walnut, so it doesn't produce that really tense sound that a hardwood flute does. And you may find people online sharing you information about hardwood flutes being a thing, but historically Native people never made flutes out of hardwoods, not unless they were in a sapling form and it was easier to carve. Giant pieces of hardwood, pawduk, let's see here, walnut, oak, purple heart, any of this kind of stuff. I know if you've looked for Native American flute for a minute, you've heard these words, these descriptions of wood, and they're not something Native people have ever made flutes out of historically that I'm aware of. The reason being is a lot of work. I mean, today we have fancy electric machines to do this, but back in the old days, carving this stuff out with a knife isn't always easy. So it's kind of logic, but there you go. Anyway, this open hold flute, open mouthpiece flute, is easy to play. You actually have a little more control on how to play the flute and control the air by doing it this way. So don't feel intimidated by this. This is actually like and has been made as a replacement for a river cane flute. That's the reason we make these and offer them today, is because they are similar on so many levels, including the wall thickness, how it's designed. Everything is based on our river cane flutes. So the difference is between this and a river cane flute is you don't have to worry about this one cracking for the most part, and people can take care of this a lot simpler than you can a river cane flute. A river cane is like if you own a Lamborghini, who's going to change your oil for you? You know, you're going to take it to a fancy oil shop, or you're going to take it to the super oil shop down the road. So kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of another, like my dad said. One other question that I get a lot is, how long is your flute? And this is because a lot of beginners have seen flutes that were a certain size, or have read blogs about flutes that are 22 inches or 24 inches. And once again, my other description video with the playing all of these different flutes, I have a tape measure in that one so you can see how long each of them are. But a lot of people have the notion, or misconception I should say, that a long flute is a great sounding flute and a really great tone. That's not necessarily the case. This is an A flute, and it's 24 inches long. 23 inches long. So this is an A flute that's as long as, say, my E or my D, which are low tone flutes. This is an A flute that is about 18 inches long. You can see the difference in length there. And the reason that I'm able to make this flute here play an A is because I've got these holes in it to control the escape of the air. So this flute plays very much like these other two A's that I just showed you. It's just longer. This one I'm not selling right now. I might start selling them in the future, but really this is kind of for aesthetic. It's not really a necessary piece, you know. So if it's louder than these other two, it's because I spent a little more time making the block absolutely perfect. Once again, I've got a creating video where I made this flute out of a returned flute kit, a flute making kit. So this is actually made from one of our flute making kits that we offer. I've got another video called "Should You Make Your First Flute or Buy Your First Flute?" And that might be a good video for you to watch. I've got a link to it probably in the description box as well. So that's something to consider. And then the one flute that we offer as a beginner flute, and I'll tell you why, is actually in the key of high B. The high B flute is really one of my two favorites, like I mentioned. It is historically sized and shaped based on actually a Cherokee flute that I copied years and years and years, like 35 years ago, except for I copied it out of river cane, which is what it was made out of. This is made out of poplar, same wood as this one right here, except for this one's been stained with an incredibly natural stain that is like the best stuff in the world. I mean, I absolutely love this stain. We buy it from a company, it's, you know, invented by a Belgium company. It's really good stuff. It doesn't smell like anything really. It doesn't taste like anything. Not that you should be tasting it. You know, I wouldn't do that. But the reason I offer this as a beginner flute, because the fingerings are good for just about anybody. And then the open mouthpiece is not too big. It's kind of small, like our little people flutes here. And the open mouthpiece is convenient for you to begin, but not so difficult for you to try to think, can I play that? And at the same time, it is also colored differently than the other flutes, which is convenient for a lot of people because a lot of people like darker colored flutes. People want low tone flutes and dark colored flutes. They want them made out of hardwoods and you know, a lot of other ideas that people have. And I've been making these flutes and playing them and teaching people to make and play them for a long, long time. And for that reason, I think this is a good suit for a beginner. It also has a block on the top of it, like this guy here does. You know, so the little fancy totem up here on the top gives you a little bit more pride in your instrument. It's not something you have to have. Honestly, these play just the same. But having this little figurine up here might help you to think, I should pick that thing up and play it once in a while. A great sounding flute, higher in tone. It's actually a step above the A, which is kind of nice. So that's something to consider. So you'll notice none of my flutes are shiny, glossy, lacquered. There's a lot of reasons I don't do that. We have previous and upcoming videos about that. And then here's one that I'd like to share with you that I bought online. There's a couple of different companies making these and selling them online. And from my knowledge, these are all imported. Like this one right here actually has a tag on it that says it's made in China. And this tag is put there because the company doesn't want to get in trouble with the Native American Arts and Crafts Act. There are some loopholes in that Arts and Crafts Act, and one day I'm probably going to do a video about that, especially if I keep on this path and keep selling and making flutes, or keep teaching people about flutes, because you really need to know about the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. You can look it up. You won't know anything about the loopholes unless I explain it to you, or you find another native who's really angry about things for some reason or another, and then you might find some more information. But this sucker's been lacquered. It has a block on the top of it. It's 6 holes, which is something people say. Isn't a Native American flute supposed to have 6 holes? Historically, Native flutes had no holes, 4 holes, 5 holes, 6 holes, 7 holes, 8, and then we go to like 14, and there are flutes that had 2 and 3 holes, and I think I covered everybody. So historically, there are flutes with all kinds of fingerings. This one doesn't sound that great. I might have a video about this one day to describe to you why these inexpensive, I'd like to say cheap, but the people probably put some blood, sweat, and tears in making this thing, although they were in an incredible hurry to do so. But these incredibly inexpensive, most of them very imported from out of the country, Native American flutes aren't crafted by flute makers. They're not made by people who are, you know, in one essence they really are, but for the most part, they're not people that are caring about the sound quality of this. They're trying to produce something quickly, number one, so that they can have money to feed their family, which is really important. But number two, because the people in the United States, and some of them even Native American people who put their names on them, want to sell these flutes really cheaply. And they want to sell it cheaply because beginners usually think that flutes need to have beads and feathers on them. They need to have some kind of eagle especially, or a wolf howling totem on them, and they need to have 6 holes. So, oh, and don't forget lacquered. Anyway, this flute here is not a good example for a number of reasons, and especially the type of wood it's made out of is actually a Chinese pine. So, I mean, not something you could find over here very often back before the European conquest. Having said that, I hope this has answered a lot of your questions and helped you to decide what kind of flute you want. Don't forget to check out some of the links, and if nothing else, you can always ask a question. Post in the comments below what you think about this video, what you think about the flutes, how you feel about people that import flutes and stamp Native American made on them. I'd love to hear what you think about that, because I've got some ideas. But anyway, let me know if there's anything I can do. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't. And don't forget to hit the bell icon. That's like the most important thing in the entire world, because we put out a lot of videos and I want people to see them, especially, I'm not putting the videos out so I can make tons of money off of it. It's not like that. I'm putting the videos out, I hope, to be considered as a public service to help people know more about Native American flutes, about how to play them, how to make them, how to buy them, what to do with them when you get it, and so on and so on and so on. And I'll be doing these videos long after I'm dead. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this, and if you have, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, I don't know if thumbs down still counts against our towards our metrics. You can do it and let's see what happens. But anyway, I appreciate you watching. My name is Charlie Mato-Toyela. We have lots more videos. I'm signing out for now. Blue Bear Flutes and bluebearflutes.com. We hope to see you again really soon.